Hi everyone, Josh Bruce here, Director of Development and co-founder of San Jose Spotlight, the city's first community-supported nonprofit news organization dedicated to independent political and business reporting in the South Bay. You may be aware that we went virtual for all of our events for the remainder of 2020. So today is our second installment of our new virtual a series on community conversations titled San Jose Speaks. And with us today, we have San Jose Independent Police Auditor Shivaun Nurre, who will be giving an exclusive Q&A moderated by our San Jose Spotlight Board Chair, Perla Rodriguez. We encourage you all to ask questions. If you have a question for Shivaun, please drop it in the chat box there at the bottom of your screen. And if you appreciate programming like this and you enjoy our journalism, we ask you to consider becoming a San Jose Spotlight sustaining member. You can learn more by visiting sanjosespotlight.com. So with that, I turn you to our board chair, Perla Rodriguez.
Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this very important dialogue. As the country mourns the death of George Floyd, and as a country, we begin to grapple with what's happening across the country in police departments across the nation, we thought it would be important to have a dialogue today with our independent police auditor here in San Jose. And so we have a number of questions that we have developed from the San Jose Spotlight team, as well as questions that have been submitted by our readers. And so we're pleased to get the conversation started. Shivaun, welcome and thank you so much for being here with us today. Can you tell us, how did the Office of the Independent Police Auditor get established? Can you give us some background? What is the function of this office and what is its importance to the community?
Sure, thank you for the opportunity. So the office was started, formally opened in 1993. And it has some interesting background because basically it was the result of two camps in San Jose regarding the police themselves. Before that time, complaints were filed and investigated by Internal Affairs, and that's where they ended. Internal Affairs is an entity of the police department. But there were some in the community that really wanted someone outside the department, somebody with independent ears and eyes, and looking at those investigations to make sure they were fair, thorough, and complete. In 1992, a lot of the citizens wanted a civilian review board, which basically has members of our community looking at documents and talking about the investigations and having a lot of hands-on on the investigation. The police department, on the other hand, still wanted to keep the internal affairs. So our model was basically a result of a compromise. The city decided, yes, we do need an independent body looking at the investigation, but they would still be conducted by internal affairs. The big impetus moving the office over the goal line was the social unrest that came as a result of the Rodney King incident in 1992. That really galvanized the community spirit to get our office open.
Well, thank you for that explanation. As the country is looking at what's happening all across, with all of these civil actions, individuals coming out to protest and express their concerns, people would like to know, how does one go about in filing a citizen's complaint? What's the process? How do we go about doing that if we ourselves have a concern that we'd like to bring up to your office?
The process is pretty simple, but it's very important. Anyone can file a complaint. You could be a person who an officer speaks to in an uncivil manner, or puts hands on you, or searches you. You can file a complaint if you saw that happening to somebody else. You can file a complaint if you read about it in the newspaper or saw something on social media. So you don't have to be the actual recipient of what you perceive as misconduct. You can also file anonymously. So pretty much what you do is you can file with our office, or you can file with Internal Affairs. At our office, you can file online. You can call us. You can email us. And when we're back open, you can come in and make a sit-down appointment with us. process starts when you contact one of our offices. A staff member will hopefully have some communication from you about, number one, what's your concern. The next things we need are, location, time, and other identifiers, so we can go out there and hopefully find evidence about what happened. So, for instance, if you can give us approximate date, approximate time, and what happened, we can pretty much go from there. We enter that into the complaint process. As I mentioned before, internal affairs is the entity that investigates. So they are going to be trying to find, is there a crime report? Did somebody get a citation? Was their body worn camera? We're going to look at radio dispatch. We might look at whether there was a taser used, and there's taser download information. And there's a lot of information. We also might want to try, are there witnesses? So we can get witness names and information and take their statements. The officer may or may not be interviewed by internal affairs. But at the end of the day, internal affairs will look at what the allegation is. They'll gather all the evidence, and then they're going to identify what rules govern this conduct. So for instance, the number one source is going to be the duty manual, which is very long, very dense, and it contains the rules that the department set up for their own members to follow. You can find that online. We also might look to see whether or not there's applicable city municipal code that applies, or state law or federal law. They're going to take all that information together, and they're going to provide an analysis, and they're going to make a conclusion. Once internal affairs is finished, it comes over to our office, and this is when the audit process starts. We're going to look to see, number one, were all the concerns identified by the complainant listed? We want to see, was all the evidence that was out there gathered? If something's missing, we're going to say it's not complete. Please interview this officer, or please get this body worn camera, or please find this report for us. We're going to see, did the internal affairs talk to people they should have? Did they talk to the complainant? Did they re-interview the complainant? Did they attempt to talk to witnesses? Was the subject officer interviewed? We're going to look to see whether or not they applied the correct duty manual section. And lastly, we're going to be looking at that analysis. Was their finding based on good, solid analysis? And what we want is we want an investigation that's fair, thorough, complete, and objective. It doesn't meet those 4 criteria. We're going to be sending it back to internal affairs and asking that they increase the quality of that investigation.
So thank you for mentioning that. So the process again is people can file a complaint directly to your office. That can be confidential, or it can not be confidential. Internal affairs conducts the investigation, and you do the auditing. How does your office ensure that the investigation is fair? How do you determine that it's a quality investigation and that it meets a certain standard?
Well, like I said, we're going to be assessing whether or not sufficient evidence was gathered and whether the analysis was sound. We do have issues sometimes, for example, when we might look at a body-worn camera video and we might see things a little bit differently than how internal affairs sees it. And then we're going to have a back and forth about why we think a reasonable person would view it in the manner we propose. Internal affairs might say, well, the pat search was justified because they felt the person might have been armed. And we're going to ask, how can that be when the person is wearing, a tank top and skinny jeans, right? We want more information because on the face of it, we think that maybe their determination is based on supposition or assumptions, and we're going to be testing them. We test them a lot. They don't get annoyed with us, which is a good thing.
It's a tough job. As we're having this conversation, I do want to acknowledge that we have a number of people who are making comments in the chat box, and we'll be reading those comments and looking through those through this conversation. I'd like to ask you a question that is on the minds of many individuals, and that there are what people consider bad cops out there, and how do you keep them accountable? How does your office keep those bad cops accountable, but to use those terms?
Well, first and foremost, this is why it's so important for people to avail themselves of the complaint system, because we don't know about bad cops unless somebody tells us. Bad cops rarely, if ever, volunteer that they're bad cops. So every complaint can make a difference. A minimal complaint might be, you know, an officer might get minimal discipline for a minimal complaint, but if there's subsequent complaints filed, then we might have an officer that needs additional training, or maybe he needs to be deployed in a different area because he or she is not speaking. I'm sorry. What I meant to say is every complaint makes a difference because it's a way by which we can identify bad officers. Now, if there's bad conduct, generally you're going to get a higher level of discipline. It's going to be a substantial discipline, usually, you know, a 40-hour suspension, a couple days suspension, a week suspension. One problem we have with bad officers is that even if the department terminates this officer, the officer still has appeal rights. And I know there's frustration, not only in our local department, but in departments statewide, because sometimes an arbitrator or a civil service panel will return a terminated officer to the rank and file. I think there's been some talk in Sacramento to change that, but that's the current status now.
Can you tell us a little bit about your office? You know, it was established in 1993. What are some of the things that you've achieved during that time that you've been established here in the city of San Jose?
Part of our job that we've been given to pursuant to charter is to make policy recommendations. And I must say, some of those recommendations have really made a difference in our community. One of the first ones was the method by which blood draws are done for arrestees. We made a policy recommendation after the Eric Garner case about banning chokeholds. Last couple years, we made some significant changes on how force in the department is reviewed. And last year, we made a recommendation that officers should keep track when they point firearms at people, so we have a better sense of where that occurs, why it occurs, and who's getting guns pointed at them.
So those are some of the things that you have recommended as an office and have been implemented consequently. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts and reactions here in the city of San Jose as we've seen the police department, the San Jose Police Department, handle the George Floyd protests in our community. Do you think it's been appropriate how they've used rubber bullets, tear gas for crowd control? There are a lot of opinions about how they've handled this, and it's been a topic of discussion just in our recent council meeting. Tell us your thoughts about that.
Well, I'm going to qualify my answer for this reason. We have had a number of complaints, not only about individual officers and how they conducted themselves during the demonstrations, but also a policy complaint on how the department conducted itself in terms of tactics to use for crowd control. And so because I now have a complaint on my desk that I need to audit, I need to be circumspect in speaking out before that investigation is complete. I think there's an issue when you're using rubber bullets and tear gas canisters on a crowd that consists of a variety of people, especially if most of those are peaceful protesters.
Understood. Could you tell us a little bit about the San Jose model for the independent police auditor's office? My understanding is that you have a very specific oversight model. What other models are out there used in other cities across the country, and what can we learn from them?
Yeah, there's a whole range of oversight models. As I mentioned before, probably the most conservative is having your internal affairs office be your oversight agency in terms of that's where the complaint ends. The department is investigating itself, no outside eyes. Maybe on another continuum, you have the Civilian Review Board. And this is used in a variety of entities up and down the state and across the nation. It is very hands-on. The community members, chosen by a host of processes, actually are looking at the actual file. They actually might be questioning the officer, and they make a determination, and in some cases, they're getting together with the chief of police to decide the level of fit. So in between those two are a whole range of other options. As I mentioned, in our auditor model, we don't investigate. But in other models, you have your outside independent agencies hire investigators, trained investigators, and they do the investigation. And you might have a whole host of hybrids where you have an investigative model, and then you have some civilians doing some tasks on a limited scope. So there's a range, there's a broad range.
Has the model changed much from when it was established in 1993 to today?
It hasn't changed very much. We were able to have some additional authority regarding officer-involved shooting, and that we can participate in the review panel. There hasn't been a lot of change since 1993.
So that's quite a bit of time
Yeah.
since its establishment. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts about this recent push to defund the police department, whether that be here in San Jose or across the country. It's something that people are talking about. And is that viable from your perspective for San Jose?
Well, my perspective is it's taking money away from the department, but using it in other areas where everybody might be better served, including the police department. I mean, one thing we've all recognized is issue with homelessness in our community. It may be feasible and practical and a very good idea to take a look at whether or not we could take, instead of having officers handle our homeless population, to have someone else who's trained to handle that population. Officers aren't social workers, and they don't want to be social workers. Officers are a very expensive tool to use if you're basically providing, some kind of social services to a population that they're not trained to serve.
That's a great example in terms of looking at the homeless. We could apply that to domestic violence situations where we call upon the police department, or cases where people might be a threat to themselves. And there are many cases of that as well, where the police have been called. Would you say that applies as well? The thought that maybe those roles could be for another type of individual, a social worker or someone else better trained for that.
I agree that when we're talking about mentally ill people in crisis, that a crisis as mobile crisis team might be a better approach in terms of your outcome and resources spent. Domestic violence is an element which needs further study. Domestic violence often involves, physical force and resulting injuries. If someone's using a physical force on the spouse, they may well not be compliant with somebody other than an officer showing, some authority. So I would leave domestic violence open for further discussion.
We'd like to take some questions from our readers that were provided to us in advance. Bobby in San Jose asked, where can I see data about complaints? Specifically, how many complaints were filed? How many complaints were sustained? What actions or recommendations were taken on those sustained complaints? Thank you, Bobby, for your question.
Yeah, good question. So every year our office does an annual report to council. This is also, you can find it online. It has a lot of data about complaints, how many were filed, and the allegations contained in there. How many officers were disciplined, how many sustained findings were made. It also talks about cases that we agreed and disagreed with in the department. So some of those, although we can't provide specific details, we can do a sanitized version of complaints that we disagree with. That's all in here, including our recommendations.
And that's available online?
Yes.
Okay. And could you tell us, what is the data telling you here in San Jose over the course of the last few years? And has it gotten worse? Has it gotten better? Do we have less complaints? What can you tell us about trends?
So complaints have been dropping for about the last 4 or 5 years. Now, there's debate on whether that means the officers are doing better or that people have lack confidence in the complaint process or don't even know about the complaint process. We've seen that some allegations increase and some decrease, but we tend to take a look at force, which has remained pretty steady over the last 5 years. We see that the sustained rate has remained also pretty steady at about 10%. 10% of our cases will have a sustained finding, and that's going to mean there's going to be subsequent discipline. And one thing I think I should tell your listeners is that these are complaints, and my statistics are complaints that have been filed by citizens. There's a whole other box of complaints that are
We also have a question from Enrique in San Jose. Enrique would like to know, can police reform themselves without a wholesale rethinking of its responsibilities and acknowledgement of its enforcement of racism? Thank you, Enrique, for your question.
I'm sorry, Paul, could you?
Let me repeat that.
one more time.
Can police reform themselves without a wholesale rethinking of its responsibilities and acknowledgement of its enforcement of racism?
I think the key word in that question is themselves. I think that the department needs to have outside voices telling them what they should be looking at. Again, it's hard. I think it's difficult for the police to police themselves in terms of misconduct. I think it's also difficult for the police to reform themselves without availing themselves of outside experts and, crucially, the thoughts of the community.
I also have a question from Scott in San Jose. He asks, from your perspective, what additional powers does your office need to have in order to have adequate transparency and oversight over the San Jose Police Department?
Well, when I mentioned before that there's a whole host of oversight models and elements, I think, I think a crucial element would be to have outside investigators take over the investigation of certain cases and allegations. I think that would lend itself to a process that would give the community more confidence in the process. In terms of transparency, most of the transparency issues come up through state law because the misconduct process is controlled by state laws, and only recently have they pretty much made any change to that. I don't know if your readers know, but SB 1421 opened up some cases for the community to read and access, and those are cases involving an officer's use of force that results in great bodily injury, and also if there have been sustained findings for lying and or sexual assault. That's been a big change. So again, transparency is largely controlled at the state level.
I do want to mention that we have had a couple of technical difficulties, and I ask, for your patience as we work through those. We're going to go ahead and keep going with these questions. And I know there's one question where your answer was cut off and we want to have you repeat the answer. As I sort that out, let me ask another question from Baltasar in San Jose. Baltasar says, what language should community organizations advocate for to ensure that a charter change empowers the independent police auditor in the way community members want and not just what the police union and the mayor are willing to do?
Well, I would urge community organizations and community groups to contact our office with their ideas about what they would like. Because whatever change is made, we want it to be representative of the community. An oversight model that's built on community will have community confidence. I've already been speaking with the mayor and other organizations about what language I think would be a reasonable next step, but we haven't come to any agreement. And part of this also involves a conversation with the police union. The police union has certain process rights in terms of meet and confer, and they will be included in the conversation too.
And so, building on that question that you asked, how can people connect with you and get your feedback? Because what I understand from Baltasar's question is they want to better understand how they can better advocate or communicate, change for San Jose. And you being the expert in this, it seems that he's looking at how he can engage with your office. Would that be fair to say? I think based on what he's asking, what are your thoughts on that? How can people engage with your office to get that kind of feedback and consultation?
Well, currently we're, again, with shelter in place, it's a little difficult for us to go out and meet with the community. But if people are having community meetings, whether virtual or in person, we are happy to come out and speak to any group. Other than that, we'd encourage people to contact our office and to send emails.
Going back to the question where you were cut off and we weren't able to hear you, can you repeat again your answer about how, and this was Bobby's question, about where people can see data on complaints, how many were filed, how many were sustained, all of that information, where can it be found, and then any comments on what trends you're seeing or based on this data?
Every year we publish an annual report, both in hard copy and it's also available online. These reports are available back to the origin of our office in 1993. It contains statistics on complaints received, complaints closed, allegations, how many were sustained. It contains information on our recommendations and on our community outreach. And again, it's available online. So trends over the last year is probably that complaints have gone down over the last 3 or 4 years. We've seen that the uses of force have remained fairly steady in terms of the allegations. And also the sustained rate against officers is also fairly steady at about 10%. So about 10% of complaints are closed with a sustained finding, which generally will have corresponding discipline.
Thank you. Thank you for repeating that answer. We have a question from Rue. How can we increase the power of the independent auditor's office investigations and recommendations so they aren't ignored?
So to increase our power is to have a charter change. Our office was established by charter and it is very strict in terms of what we can do. Unlike other offices, I don't have a provision that says other duties as assigned. So again, to change the charter generally means that the mayor and city council develop language that they recommend putting on the ballot, and or in other cities it's been, the office has been changed by gathering signatures for ballot initiative.
So change to your office charter needs to go to the ballot. It would need to be presented to the voters, just to clarify.
Yeah, that's been the opinion that the city has voiced for been consistent since 1993.
I know there was a council meeting yesterday where there were lots of conversations and comments about the use of force, the use of pellets, tear gas. What kind of policy can be made at the council level, given that right now lots of San Jose residents are going to the council? What can be decided there? As you mentioned, the power to change comes from the voters at the ballot box. But tell us what powers does the council have?
Well, in terms of looking at police rules and procedures, the council and mayor have a lot of power. The chief of police reports to the city manager, and although the city manager generally doesn't get into micromanaging the department, he can give an indication of whether or not he believes, based on his conversation with mayor and council, on whether or not certain techniques or procedures should be banned. San Jose is no different from other cities. Again, the chief of police is a powerful person, but he does report to the city manager, and the city manager has the prerogative to give him direction.
So it's more of a guidance on day-to-day tactics, day-to-day policies and procedures, and the council can weigh in on that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We have a question from Susan, and Susan would like to know, what power does the city council have over the San Jose Police Department and the police auditor's office? Sort of what we just talked about. It says, does San Jose PD hire officers who have been let go from another police department? That's a little different. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Susan.
Yeah. So the San Jose Police Department can hire officers let go from other departments. They have the ability to do so. The question is whether they would want to do so. So every officer that gets hired goes through a pretty intensive background. Generally, that background includes contacting any prior employment in any capacity, and they will especially be looking at any prior law enforcement employment, and they will probably be talking to that department to see why the person left. Because again, if a person left and there's significant background in that they have complaints or they have personnel issues, San Jose has, might choose another candidate.
We'd like to have you touch upon another question that was asked and may have gotten cut off. We talked about how San Jose has a very specific oversight model, and we wanted to ask, what are other models that are being used in different cities, and what can we learn from other cities who are doing it differently?
So lots of other cities do things differently. Many cities, as I mentioned, have an investigator model where instead of having internal affairs, hire its own investigators and have the complaints investigated by fellow officers. They have an outside entity that hires own investigators. Let's see, Oakland just made sweeping changes to its civilian review board model. That was, I think, a couple years ago, a huge victory for civilian review panel proponents at the ballot box. And they've been trying to implement those changes over the last few years. And then, there's a whole host of other models. And generally what we learn from them is, what works best, at least in their community? What challenges do they have in terms of implementing these models? Civilian Review Board has been seen as very popular in the community, but sometimes you run into issues of not completing the work in a timely fashion. And you have to do it in a timely fashion in order to discipline an officer. So again, you just learn a whole host of things. And since there's so many different models, there's no one lesson we can learn universally.
So true. Ed would like to know, can you investigate a complaint first without internal affairs? Is that possible, or is your office, it does not have an investigatory role?
We don't have an investigatory role. We do not investigate before we send it over to internal affairs.
As we sit here, and thank you for all this great information, I know that myself as a San Jose resident and someone who's staying on top of this issue, we're all wondering, what is next for San Jose? And so I'd like to once again, ask you to tell, the community, tell our readers a little bit about what you recommend if you have concerns about this issue and you'd like to see San Jose make changes. What are things that people can do to begin that process? Obviously, getting informed as we are today is very important. And I think, to your point, there are a lot of lessons to be learned across the country. But what can we do in San Jose to begin that process if folks are looking for change?
Couple things to recommend. If you want to learn more about the different agencies that do oversight and the different models, there's a national organization for civilian oversight. It's called NACOLE, N-A-C-O-L-E. Great website, and it has a great resources if you want to learn more about what's happening nationwide and the different models. The issue of possible expansion for our office was a topic that came up a couple years ago, and at that time the mayor and council had a study session. We've not had a study session on this topic since then, although there has been some progress with the police union and attempting to work out a side letter which would provide some expansion. If the community is interested, they could a possibility is to have another study session, since it seems like the whole world has changed in the last 2 weeks, and that minds and hearts have really shifted about how we police in our communities. So that would be something that, if people are interested, to contact their mayor or council members.
I'm looking at the chat box, and there are individuals who are wondering if you can provide resources. Someone says, can you provide an action plan that can be provided to constituents on what steps can be taken to make these changes? Is that something that your office would do, be able to provide some resources and information?
Yeah, we're actually developing things now. Again, I'm trying to give people a range of options so that I'm not driving this process. It should be a process that the citizens are weighing the pluses and minuses. But we will be developing some resources so people know the different models, that people are aware of what we see are the benefits and detriments of various models. And also I will do some weighing in on the things that I think would work in our community.
This question seems maybe more to an election expert or someone who's an expert in politics, but I'll ask it. Someone would like to know, what's the deadline for submittal of a charter amendment for a November ballot? Is there time, right? We have an election coming up in November. Is that something that still there may be time for?
So yeah, I'm not an expert on this, but my general understanding is that language on ballot measures need to be brought to the council in June. And then I believe actual language needs to be approved in early August in order to make the November 2020 ballot.
So it sounds like time is of the essence in order to get something on the ballot. And obviously that's a question for someone who's an expert in elections and ballot measures. But thank you for that question. I think it's a very good question. And
on that point, I mentioned a side letter with the city and the POA have been working on. And it's my impression that the language from that side letter will be discussed at an upcoming council meeting. It's either the second to the last or the last council meeting in June. So if your readers are interested, they should look at the agenda, and then also that's a great opportunity to weigh in, either to your specific council member or to join in at the council meeting and voice your thoughts.
And I should mention that there is going to be a council meeting this Friday where this topic will be addressed. And so individuals who'd like to learn more about that meeting should visit the City of San Jose's website for more information about Friday's meeting. But there's continued dialogue about what's happening in San Jose. We have a question from Whitney. How can we file a complaint against how officers handled the San Jose protests. So Whitney would like to know, what does she have to do to file a complaint?
So Whitney can call our office. She can send an email to our email address, or she can go to our website. You'll find a big green button that says file a complaint. And that's probably the easiest way. It'll take you through a very brief form, and then you'll be getting an acknowledgement email from our office that we received your concern. And again, we have already received a whole host of general policy complaints about how the police conducted themselves during the demonstrations. And again, also individual officers about how they conducted themselves.
Interestingly here, I'm looking through the chat, and we also have a comment from a reader who says, officers need to be mandated to report other officers when they see bad behavior. Is that something that you see complaints from other people within the department?
So generally, if an officer is going to report another officer's bad behavior, they're going to do it through a supervisor, and that becomes a department-initiated complaint, which is that box of complaints that I do not see. It's my understanding that the chief is coming out with a duty manual provision on the duty to report. And I can provide that to you, Perla, as soon as it comes off my desk.
There are a number of things that we've covered today, and we continue to receive questions. Janet would like to know, can you explain the role of the police auditor's office in the complaint process? They'd like to know again, how do you fit in this whole process of investigation?
So our role is, number one, we're an entity that takes complaints. So if a member of the public has an issue, they can file a complaint with our office. We do not investigate. All complaints are turned over to Internal Affairs, who are SJPD officers, and they investigate. They're going to look at what rules apply, what evidence they can gather, and then make a determination in terms of the duty manual sections that govern the conduct. Where we come in is we take a look at that investigation, and we're going to think, is this investigation fair, thorough, and complete? And if it's not, then we push back on the department to improve that investigation until we're satisfied that it is fair, thorough, and complete.
And can you tell us what the role of the Police Officers Association or the Union for Police Officers, what is their role in this process?
So in California, like other states, there's a set of laws called the Peace Officer Bill of Rights. And union representatives are involved in the complaint process to make sure those rights and privileges afforded to the officers by law are followed.
I am continuing to see a number of comments from our San Jose Spotlight readers. I want to thank everyone for continuing to be with us in this conversation and sharing with us your concerns about this particular topic. As we begin to wrap up this conversation, we want to remind people, again, there is a council meeting that's coming up on Friday. You can contact Shivaun Nurre directly in her office to ask questions about the process for filing a complaint, learning more about the process for making changes to the charter that currently governs this office. These are really important questions that need answers, and in terms of being able to make change, what we've learned today is that these things happen through the ballot box. And so we hope that this dialogue has been informative. It certainly has for me, as I've learned a number of things about how the police department, what oversight, how oversight currently happens for the police department. And the comments continue to come in. We have others who want to know, or people are making statements about a need for an independent civilian oversight. The possibilities are endless. And so, Shivaun, I'd like to just open it up for any other comments you'd like to make as our readers are listening, and they'd love to hear from you. Any other last thoughts as we close this conversation, which has been so informative? Thank you. We're sound is back on.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to stress that we do encourage people to make complaints. It's important in terms of, you know, tracking down individual problem officers, and we don't know about that unless someone tells us. It also helps us determine whether or not we have trends in the community. So a trend that we identified some years back was that people, even though they weren't complaining about it, we heard that people were tired of being put on the curb, which they found demeaning. So now the department tracks who's put on the curb, right? And so we can see the demographics of that, and we have it up on our website. Also, it helps us to make policy recommendations. A complaint we received a couple years ago was that you know, a young girl at a local high school was interviewed by an officer, and he didn't record the interview. Then later there was discussion about whether the officer conducted himself appropriately during that interview, and we made a recommendation last year. You know, every interview should be recorded. It's so easy to record now. So complaints help us. They help us, they help the community, and they help the department. So if you read about something, if you see something, if you hear about something, please contact us.
Shivaun, thank you so much for your time today. As I said before, there's much that I've learned through this conversation, and I'm sure our San Jose Spotlight readers have as well. This is a topic that will be top of mind for all of us here in San Jose for a long time. And we encourage, you know, our readers to continue to engage with us. Send us your questions, your comments. This has been a very informative dialogue, and we look forward to having others like this. And so on behalf of San Jose Spotlight, as the board, as part of the board of directors, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to having new conversations on this topic and many others. Have a wonderful evening. We thank everyone. Please be safe, and we look forward to the next one. Thank you very much.